Thank you, Julian. Thank you for the intro. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about the long-term impact of media, and actually in developing a measurement framework to do that, actually it reveals the key brand KPIs ultimately that have an impact on driving the long term of brands. And actually once you have that knowledge, that direct line of sight of the value of shift in those brand KPIs, obviously you've got a key ingredient that you can use in the creative briefing process. I think we all know there's significant change in the industry. We get told that at every conference we go to. But essentially the shift towards data-driven measurable channels, that is where the money has flowed, the increases in digital budgets in the marketplace. It has become increasingly a short-term game, a short-term conversion media that has been used. And actually long-term brand-building media, typically on the broadcast channels high reach, has come more into question in the mix. Now, if we think about sort of classically the awareness funnel, the awareness driving sort of beautiful brand creative high reach, that has been decreasing as a percentage of the overall investment, and it's all down the pointy conversion end of the funnel where the focus and the increases have been made. But clearly the awareness brand building media has a significant impact on the conversion metrics and the conversion media and how they work. So if we look at some evidence of what's happened, actually I was here last year and I saw a very similar chart being shown for the US, and you can see a similar chart for pretty much every marketplace. But if you look at the split in UK advertising spend by task in 2000, to my right, to your left, it used to be 60% was, or plus 60% on brand display, analog display, predominantly brand campaigns on TV in that context. And if you see how that has shifted, that has reduced significantly, and it's the direct response advertising that has increased markedly during that period. So how do we measure this? I was actually here talking last year, and there's been talks during the last couple of days about the measurement system of what we're now sort of terming the unified model, or at Ebiquity we call it the total view attribution. Now, on the right-hand side, you've got the attribution methodologies that gives you the detail of all of the digital placements and creatives. But we know there is a natural bias in digital attribution modeling that it basically assigns credit for all of the sales to those digital touchpoints and effectively ignores, in the majority of cases, the broadcast media and critically the base. Now, you can use that unified model to rescale the digital touch points, and that's one thing, but there is still a component missing from that model, and not many companies are actually using that total unified model to get that scaling. But if we think about the base, the key question is what drives the base, because in healthy brands, the base contributes the majority of sales, and if you're going to understand what drives the brands in the long term, you need to understand what drives that base. And that's where the brand equity modeling comes in that I'm about to describe. So we're talking about understanding the impact of shifting brand KPIs and how they impact the long-term base. Now, I don't know if there's anyone out there who's ever had the job of explaining to their board or their CEO the value of shifting key metrics, perhaps from your sort of Millward Brown or sort of Ipsos tracking, if you're in a bank, whether the trust metric has increased. It's a very difficult conversation to have. There is general faith that if you shift those key metrics, yes, it's important, but there's no quantification available as to if you raise those metrics by a point, what's the value to the long-term P&L of doing that? And that's where this modeling comes in. And if I just essentially explain the format. So the current state of play is you've got your ad investment, and you're generally looking at short-term sales. So 99% of the mix modeling out there is essentially looking at the impact on sales, or it could be quotes in the case of direct line, but the commercial metric within up to 6 months from the deployment of the media. But we all know, we've seen media that has a much longer term effect than that. There's academic work written about it, sometimes you can measure it. But it's not overly useful just saying, well, the long-term factor is this much bigger than the short-term if you don't know what is driving it. And that's where this comes in. So if you can actually link the media to changes in customer perceptions, to the brand tracking changes, and ultimately link that to the long-term, then you can derive that answer. So essentially how this can be done, we can talk more about it later if there's questions on this, is you build a typical mix model. So in the short term, so you can get all of the relevant sort of price, promotion, short-term media out. Then you build the model so that it's got a dynamic base. So you relax that constraint, and then you're explaining the long-term base evolution in the middle part there through a network of brand metrics. So you're classifying the media by type, whether it's brand media or conversion media, and then seeing how it impacts that structure and ultimately impacts the long-term base. Okay. What do you get from this? Well, ultimately, it enables you to break down the growth in the base through time. So if you've got perhaps last year's base on the far side, you can start to see what is driving that base in the long term. Now, you can see the media there in yellow. In this particular case, actually, is a relatively small component of it. And actually, it's the brand KPIs that are driving that, and actually the interaction with the brand and the buzz and the talkability. In most cases, actually, the media is more significant in the long term than that. And then you've got the structure of what's driving those image statements revealed by the modeling as well. Ultimately, what that enables companies to do is to plan on that basis. So if you're classifying different campaigns, so you've got sort of brand advertising, direct comms, etc., it enables you to see that how those investments impact the key brand KPIs that are relevant to your industry, ultimately how that impacts volume and value, and then you've got the short-term and long-term ROIs, which if you look across some of those, there's very big differences in different types of campaigns as to how they drive the short term and how they drive the long term. And then you can then plan for a balanced hitting your short term objectives while also planning for the long term. Now, one company to say is Direct Line that we've been working with them for a number of years now, and we've been developing these models for the Direct Line brand itself and the other brands within their portfolio. We've got a video of Mark, who I think will explain why they use a gangster to advertise insurance products, which I must say initially seems a bit strange, but I'll hand over to Mark.
Insurance is probably as close to perfect competition as you get. There's literally hundreds of providers doing pretty much exactly the same thing. And so that provides a really short-term focus. We've got to deliver our plans, in a competitive marketplace. But I think on top of that, we are a very financially oriented company. It sounds obvious, but insurance is full of very financially literate people. And so particularly from the board level, the need to prove it to really show our commercial viability in our marketing activity is very, very strong, stronger than other sectors I've experienced. And hence the pressure to be able to demonstrate a return, short and long term, but particularly short term is very pressing. So insurance is a bit weird in that sense, the operating model and also the sort of financial orientation probably makes it stand out a little. So the whole of marketing really has moved a lot more towards a short-term focus in the last 5 or 10 years. And of course, the risk is you neglect long-term brand building responsibilities. In really simple terms, the brand equity work has allowed us to provide the quantitative linkage between the two so that we can manage the short and the long term, but specifically at maintaining commercial credibility with the rest of the organisation, so it's not just sort of made up that there's a long-term benefit to investing in a brand. So I think it's sort of the diligence and the economics around brand building that brand equity has really unlocked. So I think there's a real paradox with the advent of digital in that digital data is sort of abundant, and you know, a bit like methamphetamine, it's sort of super addictive, and you can get boards sort of addicted to that short-term feed of digital data. But of course, the challenge of the marketer is to stay media agnostic. And so for us, it's a sort of a critical challenge that we're not going off down blind alleys. And so some of that is our third parties, including Ebiquity, frankly, but also diverse thinking in the team to make sure that we're managing short and long term. And that stretches through until to understanding the diverse brains that we have in the team. So we've got quite a big focus on something called neurodiversity, which is about recognizing and embracing the virtues of people with very different brains. It stretches into dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, and so on. But very conscious about we need critical challenge within the team. Otherwise, it is easy to go down a big data blind alley. And of course, in the end, you've got to trust your judgment. And in the case of Direct Line, having a gangster as a representative in one of the least trusted sectors in the world, you know, that was a judgment decision, not a data decision. Retrospectively, it looks like a really good data decision as well. But it's about holding all of these things in balance.
Okay, just a summary slide, but ultimately you can measure the long term, and if you can get those key metrics out, the brand metrics, you know what to focus on in the creative development to maximize the long-term growth of your brands. Thank you.
Okay.